Welcome, Intelligence Analysis, Ontology Engineering. Today, as you have become accustomed, we will be discussing and engaging with, on a concrete, in-your-face way, design patterns. Where did we pick up or leave off last time? The place we'll pick up today. Encrypted information. I just want to remind you, we were modeling something of this sort. Information encrypted on a solid-state drive. You sent me some info about it. I don't know who sent me this, but I think it's very pretty. I do like the way this looks. It's clean. Let's look at it for a minute. Let's dig in. Let's play a skeptic slash academic. So you got instance of relations. You got a nice legend over the top. I'm digging it. You got a miscapitalization for flash, but that's fine. I'll overlook it. There's some confusion here. So you have rounded things are instances and diamonds are classes. So it makes sense to have instance of relationships between the rounded and the diamonds. Although there's an ISA relationship up here from software and GDC. ISA is typically, we understand it to hold between classes. And so that would suggest that either software is a class or GDC is an instant, or I'm sorry, that software is a class, which is not true. Also, we have key storage pointing to software saying key storage is an instance of it. So I think the intent was that software be a class, but it has the wrong edges or wrong corners. So, okay. In any event, look at that. I just sorted out what the intent was. Things happen, typos happen. Okay. Not going to hold too much to that. So firmware is an instance of software. That seems wrong. Yeah. Seems like there can be many types of firmware. Of course, this could be a labeling issue. If we're being charitable, we just look at that and say that what they meant was like a specific instance of firmware, right? And so it's useful though to have like a convention for identifying like labeling instances so that they're distinct from what you might call the classes under which they fall. So I might call, for instance, firmware as a class as distinct in its label from like firmware _1 as an instance. So we usually put some kind of appending like convention, like 1_A, something like that, some sequential thing so we can count. Same with key storage. Presumably that's supposed to be a specific instance of key storage.
Can a key storage that is an instance of software have a material entity as part?
Let's see, where's that coming in? It's key storage. It's an instance of software, which is a GDC. Oh yeah, has part encryption key. Yeah. So no, anything with parts is, or I'm sorry, anything with material parts is material entity, because material, being a material entity is closed under that. So you can have lots of things that have immaterial parts. You can have something that is a material entity that has a material part and an immaterial part. Or you can even have, I mean, parthood is very open. You can have some generically dependent continuous thing that's part of something that is material. The important part is together, that thing is a material thing. Does that make sense? So strictly speaking, absolutely not.
So that if it was the other way, it'd be fine.
Where the encryption key has part.
Yeah, possible.
Yeah, that would be fine. It could be fine. I'm not sure if it's accurate, but like that wouldn't violate, the underlying BFO principles now. So like what's going on here is like if you put this in OWL and ran a reasoner over it with BFO, you'd get an inconsistency because you'd be saying something is both a material entity and a generically dependent continuant, and you can't do that. And just so you see the logic there, it's because you're asserting that this thing, you'd be asserting this thing, a key storage is a generically dependent continuant, it's found on its own, but then you would be asserting something or else that entails that it's also a material entity, namely that it's part of something, it has a part that is a material thing, and that those two together would entail that key storage is a material thing. And so you can't have both. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's see, keep going, flash memory. So these are kind of like the formal, just broad strokes, formal reflections. Let's look at the substance. So is a key storage an instance of software? Maybe. Is firmware an instance of software? Maybe. Is it encryption key an instance of, is it a material thing? Is a bus card a material thing? I mean, part of this is like these expressions are ambiguous, the labels are ambiguous. We could mean many things. That's fine. We should expect it, especially when we're in the business of modeling information. So to be charitable to this, I will just look at this from the perspective of a group that was just trying to model one aspect of the ambiguity. I think it's reasonable. We can't expect everybody to boil the ocean. We shouldn't expect that when we're making design patterns or judging them ourselves. Unless, and here's the pro tip, unless you're trying to make a point or make an example of some group. So one of the reasons why we go through chopping things down is because sometimes when we're out in the wild, you need to make an example of people or organizations that don't know what they're doing. You could perhaps charitably interpret design patterns or ontologies that you see in the wild, and like that's useful, and it's probably like close, it will probably get you to a place closer to the original intent of the modeler. On the other hand, there are a lot of bad ontology or people building bad ontology work out there. This is just a case, it's just facts. And if you went around interpreting everything charitably, then everything starts looking fine. And so this is what I mean by sometimes you just need to make an example. So what do I mean more concretely? You're part of the community here. You're learning, you're training. It's okay for me to be charitable. It's okay for me to help you uncover what your intent was, and I'm happy to do so. So we can be clear and careful and like watch out for mistakes and stuff. But we are part of the family. If I saw this in the wild, I would be brutal. I would absolutely be brutal. I'd be calling into question your competence as a human being. And this is what Barry does too. It's part of like because we can't let work like this go undetected or like enter into projects without question. Like even if that goes on without, like after we've given a critical review, we still need to be there saying, this is bad. This is bad. We have standards. We have high standards, and this does not meet them in any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, I'm like attacking this, but you see, do you get what I'm saying, right? Like, and what that often results in is that folks will either ignore and then they'll continue to do bad work, and then they'll suffer for it. Ultimately, that's what happens. Or they'll come, what more often happens is they'll take the criticism and they'll say, oh God, you're right. Because a lot of the things that I just pointed out are pretty obvious, right? Like, this is a material entity. Like you just said something inconsistent. And like, oh snap, you're right. Sometimes you just have to make that clear to them in an aggressive way. And also the broader point, you have to make that clear in an aggressive way to groups that are funding this work who might not know what we're doing. If you can point out like obvious logical errors of the sort I was pointing to a minute ago in a clear, precise, and sometimes aggressive manner, and some folks who are up in the like higher echelon who are doing procurement, I mean, it's obvious to them what you pointed out, and they're like, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't buy this. Maybe I should trust the person who's throwing shade. So, okay, I just want to make clear, like there's this balancing act that goes on. Like there's opportunities and avenues that we should be charitable and like try to uncover what's going on and like help people be better, help ourselves be better at this. But there are also a lot of groups who are doing bad work, and sometimes they have their motivations conflict with ours. Maybe they're like proprietary, maybe that, but sometimes we just have to cut through that and be critical like we can. Yeah.
So in this instance, if you wanted to show that something might have part in a GDC and part in a material entity, should it be two different key storages then, or?
You mean like to source out the ambiguity because there's some intuition here, or maybe it's like born out of some of the research you were doing
Yeah.
that says, look, there's this notion of key storage that is the pattern, like a repeatable pattern. There's also a notion of key storage that's like a material thing. And I hear we're trying to kind of connect them in some way. But like, how would we do it? Would we have one thing that in this case is inconsistent, or would we have two things and somehow relate them differently? The answer is two things. We'd have the material thing, we have the pattern, and then what we have is a relationship between the pattern, like bearing or dependent on in some way the material thing. So that, and we have relationships for that already. So you could expand this and fix it so that that intuition is taken like addressed. And I always encourage that, right? If you see if you see something like this, there's that charitability that enters in. You can fix this. You know how. We have the resources to fix this. And sometimes we should. And sometimes we shouldn't. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Matthew?
I just wanted to be clear that, in the wild, if you are evaluating some sort of pattern, insufficiency is not the same as doing it wrong. And so be harsh on the wrongness, on illogicality.
Mm-hmm.
But insufficiency, is that the point to be charitable? Because when I was thinking about the pressures to produce, the pressures to get things done, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to have a full design pattern ever.
Sure.
And so at what point
Well,
is that fun?
so this is I hear what you're saying. You're trying to draw like a line, like a litmus test or heuristic between like how exactly do we judge when to be charitable or not?
Correct.
And the answer is it's less to do with the quality of the work, and it's more to do with the intent behind the work. And like the knowledge behind the work, the willingness of people who are behind the work to learn and change their minds or like repair. Sometimes you will encounter folks, this happens not infrequently, and you point this stuff out and they're like, good Lord, please help me. And sometimes you see this and you'll never hear from them again, but they'll pop up later. You'll see them later somewhere else and you'll have to deal with them later. So we want to cut that out as much as possible. So it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call, and I can help you sort that out. So it's less about that. And I will say, like, just in terms of dialectic, though, if you have those crucial logical points, those are the ones that are easiest to cut through. Because if you start talking about sufficiency, people watching like leadership or seniors, execs or something, they're not going to know. Like they're not going to pick up on this. You'll have to explain. You'll have to do too much explaining. Their eyes will glaze over. But if you can point out straight logical problems to where they're looking, half paying attention, and they're like, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, that was dumb." And then even if you get the other team on board, the developers or whomever did it, and they're like, "Yeah, we made a mistake," you won, right? Like you've made your point. And sometimes you just have to do that aggressively.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not going to
So
point it out.
one thing that I found really useful is I'll work up a problem, like an answer that is something that I could bring to class, right? And you guys would understand. And then I have to dumb the language down, okay? So that so you have to understand who you're talking to. So you have to understand, are you talking to somebody on a dev team that doesn't understand what object property assertions are and doesn't really care? Or are you talking to a senior leader who just wants to know that they're like relations? And then you have to know like who you're talking to and what they really care about. So like if you're talking to somebody on a dev team, they might care how this is going to affect the API. But if you're talking to a senior, they might just care how this is going to catch bad guys. Right. So you have to know who you're talking to so that you can win. This is something that we have to deal with all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Jay's not exaggerating. We need to appropriately model for the level and for the audience that we're trying to reach. And if we're off on our messaging, it's detrimental. So if it's not in the weeds too much, then it doesn't resonate and we go on the wrong track. If it's way too high, like we never try to show a senior protege because that's just way too much. And so like that's when we know we're in trouble, when when we start doing that. So we always try to keep it higher level for them because they don't want it and don't need it, and it only causes problems.
That's right.
Like you might be really excited because you built this out and you built all the data properties and you have all the ranges and the domains for the data properties and everything. You're really excited. You got to be careful who you show that to, because that's just going to gloss up. Like John said, they're going to get bored with it. They're not going to know what they're seeing. You got to keep it really, really simple. Right?
It'll hurt you.
It'll hurt you. And it's crazy, right? Because it's sort of like a politician that says like, oh yeah, I passed Bill HR 75, and then the public doesn't know what the hell that is. But then another politician says, hey, I put more money in your pocket, right? And then somebody's going to be like, oh, that's so simple. Why did he say it that way? But then it resonated. So, and this is something like you're going to have to realize that like you have to become warriors. You have to become like ontology warriors and realize that like every day for the rest of your career, you need to justify your existence.
That's not a bad mentality to be in. even if you don't actually have to, it's still not a bad mentality to be in. It's good to have that tool in the toolkit. You got to be a little bit of a politician. I mean, to be successful, if you just want to be like a crank turning ontologist, I mean, you don't maybe not have to worry about this stuff. But like if you, we need more of the other sort, honestly. Let me move on. You can barely see this, but I like it anyway. Yeah, I like the pattern, I like the paper. Let's see, what do we have? We have some BFO stuff, material entities, qualities, process information, or like the schema stuff, I'll say. No legend. All right, beat this up. You guys do it. Beat it up. Act like this is an enemy. Just for a second.
Get closer to the screen.
Huddle up. See?
Imagine somebody has pitched this and you guys are rivals on a contract. Like they're pitching this and you have your own thing, and all so far this is all you've seen, and you're like, I have to take this mofo down.
Boss thing.
Does.
Yeah. There are a couple of ways to handle this. All right, check this out. So you're right, data bus thing. You could just say, well, this is obviously silly, or you can make it memorable. I see John Sweet at NGA, he does this sometimes. He says, anytime, he's like, I call it the sweet rule. Anytime you have a class or something and you can just replace it with the word thingy, something's gone wrong. You might, that's a memorable thing to say. Like you could just say, there's this heuristic I use, this sweet rule I call it. I can tell you more about this guy I get it from, but like, yeah, say the rule and then be like data bus thing. Yeah, it seems like a thingy. It seems like it like under the scope of the sweet rule, right? And that's something they'll remember. Mhm. Say that more forcefully.
I don't understand how these things relate to each other, guys.
Say that less sassy. Aggressive, but direct and confident. Try it.
I am.
You can do it. I believe in you.
I am having trouble understanding how the different classes and relate to each other, as there is no direct label.
Okay, we're getting closer. That was better. That was better. Good. Yeah, Matthew. Go for it.
So the design pattern is quite beautiful, but it's unclear how the classes relate to each other, mostly because the edges aren't labeled, but even the labels that are there, I'm not quite sure, I'm not able to clearly see how all of these different elements are related. And I think that's going to cause major problems when you start adding in the other elements that are just kind of floating underneath these stickers.
Yeah. I might use that kind of line or that. I mean, the point would remain the same, but I might use that way of pitching this as an engineer or like a team. If I were talking to somebody who doesn't care that much or doesn't understand enough of the weeds, I might say something like, starting at a higher level and be like, my understanding of what we do involves like creating like models that can be like represent explicitly like the semantics of different data structures. And that means I have to kind of get specific about the relationships across different rows and columns or whatever. These are just arrows. I have no idea what these arrows mean. And if I don't have any idea what these arrows mean, computer's not going to have any idea what these arrows mean. And so there's, some work to do on fleshing out the relationships here. And kind
Also, when you do something like this, it's going to make somebody think you're building something in like a property graph. And we never want to ever make somebody think we're ever building in a property graph because they suck and they're not explicit. Yeah.
That's right. They like smuggle in information that's hard to extract out later. So like hitting that expressivity point, that like making this explicit, the implicit logic. And you don't have to go, I mean, you can stick at that high level and just let that settle because they're going to they'll be looking at this and they'll be like, yeah, dude, I have no idea what this means. I just see a bunch of labels, which is true. But, labels only mean something to machine if you build out the semantics around the labels. Let's move on to a scenario. A patrol boat moving at a speed of 12 knots over 1.5 hours. Check it out. The thing's going fast. Rules of thumb. Remember, if I'm asking you to build a design pattern, here's like a list of things you can do. There's like a rules of thumb you should follow. Start with the material things and look at qualities of it, processes, what the things do, what kind of like boundaries they have or where they're located. Also, you know, when they're existing, and then patterns about them. Dang it, did I spell dependent wrong again? Oh, what's wrong with it? And you can start by listing this sorts of stuff. Like here's the categories. You've got buckets. You can just start listing things in the buckets. You may need to skip some categories. A patrol boat moves at a speed of 12 knots over 1.5 hours. So here, let me walk you through this. Patrol boat seems like it'd be needed to answer this competency question, right? And that's what you're doing. You're listing off the things you need to answer this competency question. You'd need some motion, right? Make sense? You need some motion. You need a speed. Okay, here's where we get tricky. We see this again and again and again when we're modeling things. So here's a rule of thumb, like a heuristic, some strategies you can use to get around or like articulate the ambiguity without letting it block you, because ambiguity will block you. You can see it, you can suss it out, and you can be like, I don't know what to do with it. And it can really stifle your progress. So do this instead. Just note that there's ambiguity in the list. Put an asterisk or note it somewhere. Just do that. Speed is often ambiguous. Do you mean the measurement? Do you mean the thing, like the actual thing moving or whatever? Do you mean a measurement of it? What measurement of it? Like, so don't even engage with that yet. You're just listing. Okay? Just put it in a bucket and mark that you'll need to come back and revisit it.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Does this relate to our conversation we had yesterday? Like the fact that like we need to get away from thinking about classes from what they're called.
Oh, yeah.
We have to start thinking about classes from how their hierarchy is, because speed is not a process in the way that you're wanting to use it. Speed is more, I'm not looking at CC, and this is why everybody should download the CCO All Core. And when you're doing this stuff, you should open it, right? Because what you'll realize is I think speed is either like a quality or a disposition. It's something that acts on like a material artifact that's going to be involved in the process. So the problem that I see a lot is we're lazy by nature. So the first thing we see, we're like, oh, that's good. And then we don't realize, oh, that's an information content entity. That's not a material artifact. Or, oh, that's a quality. That's not a process.
No, this is absolutely right. And this is what I'm suggesting here is a way to make progress, or at least teach yourself to habituate yourself into making progress through the ambiguities, because these will block you. You will look at a competency question. You will start progressing through it with the easy stuff, like I was doing. Patrol boat, it's easy. I mean, I wrote this competency question in this way on purpose, right? Patrol boat, easy. Motion, easy. Ambiguity, speed, right? Okay, so you can hopefully see yourself in this process. You can probably see that you've done this before. And so what I'm saying now is that blocker, here's a strategy to get around it, at least note the ambiguity, and then move on and then revisit it later once you have a full list. And then I'm about to walk through how you resolve or work through the resolution through those ambiguities too. So like we won't just leave it there, but I do think you should finish the list, right? And you should get in the process or get in like the habit of finishing the list. So like, here's another easy one, 12 knots measurement. Here's another ambiguity, hours, right? Is it an information? Is it a temporal region? You've got this slotted into buckets. Okay, now revisiting the ambiguity. This is the next stage. You've listed the things, and look, you've walked through, and I've highlighted these in green as we progress. You walk through the parts of the competency question, things that you need to model. Now we can revisit. We'll go back and start thinking through speed and thinking through the hours, okay? Speed as a process versus information about a process. Speed, almost textbook characterization. Speed is a magnitude of change in position over time. is information-y stuff. That's the intuition behind speed as information. Also, speed is the changing of positions over time. The process, the thing that the measurement's about. And I'm not saying these are exhaustively the ways to understand speed. Okay? I'm not at all. There are other ways to understand speed. Just for the sake of this example, here's some intuitions. You may or may not have these intuitions, but these are certainly not uncommon intuitions to have about modeling speed. And in fact, I'll show you a design pattern from that collection of CCO design patterns where they modeled this example and they modeled speed as a process. So it happens. Like these things, they're not uncommon intuitions to have, and you should keep them in mind. The question you should ask yourself, though, is which do we care about to answer this competency question? That's how you sort out the ambiguity. Like there's ambiguity everywhere. What are you trying to solve? What are you trying to answer? That's what you should ask yourself about figuring out whether you're talking about speed as a process versus information. For my part, I would think of this as information. You've got 12 knots, right? Like that's the thing. I mean, to me, this competency question looks like it's about measurements. How about this? 1.5 hours is a temporal region versus information about such a region. On the one hand, I mean, you can be talking about the measurement or you can be talking about the thing measured. What do you think? You can have both for sure. Remember the litmus test. What are we trying to do with that in answering that competency question? Which one are we modeling? What do we need to answer it?
Data property, I think,
Because
because that lets you calculate, if you're probably trying to calculate distance traveled or something potentially.
1.5 hours. Like you're trying to, it's like 15, whatever,
12
12 knots over 1.5 hours. Yeah. Are you interested in the region of time, like 1.5 hours, or you're interested in a measurement about the region? Yeah.
It doesn't matter which part of the day it occurred in.
Yeah, right. Here's what the CCO design pattern said. This is how they modeled it. Beat it up.
Copy this directly, or did you recreate this?
Nope, I copied it directly.
I don't know what a Kurzon is.
Kurzon is a relationship between process and temporal region. So
It doesn't seem to exist.
it's an older object property.
That's what.
But it is essentially just a relationship between the process and temporal regions on which they occur.
But it occurs in now, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's Kurzon now. In any event, there is a relationship currently in the
Well,
file
that's fine.
it may just be labeled something else. But that aside, what do you think? I am highly critical of this if it helps, but go ahead.
They have done like a spatial temporal region and then had like the continuing parts of the.
They could have. They certainly could have. So trying to answer that may be another way to address the competency question. That competency question is a patrol boat moves at a speed of 12 knots over 1.5 hours. They're trying to model that. I mean, that would be one way to lean. If you wanted a fuller picture of what they've modeled here, they would have used spatiotemporal regions, because then you have the spatial thing, you have the thing like located in space, you have the process that it participates in, you have the temporal aspect and space and time project on there. Like that would be a fuller picture of this model, which is, I think, accurate. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you care about the speed of the control trip, we don't care about the temporal.
Yeah. I would have modeled this more as information. So they took the other side. They took the processy side and they took the temporal region side. But there was that was the other option. Like there were like four, because there were two ambiguities, there are 4 ways to model this. You could have gone like one process, one information, one process, one temporal region, one information. Yeah, you just sort out the options there, but like they picked the option where they just focus on the process, but just focus on the temporal region, and information doesn't really come into the picture, except as like annotation properties hanging off. Yeah.
Just on the right side, so I'm still confused what a process profile is, number one. Number two, why isn't it just speed? Why does it have to be speed 1?
So remember what I was saying earlier about trying to distinguish in our naming or labeling of instances versus the classes under which they fall. And so speed is a class, there's a class speed, and then there's a specific instance that they're interested in of speed. It's like, because there could be many instances of speed, and they're just curious or interested about modeling speed 1, and they just gave it that one name to differentiate it from other types of speed. So that's for process profiles themselves. So I think of, if you think of processes as like blocks of things doing stuff. They have like, and I'm thinking of it in the spatiotemporal sense, so like 4 dimensions of these things, right? You can like slice them vertically. You can like take a slice of John in the middle of a sentence, frozen in time, right? We can do that. We do that when we're trying to like identify indices and of things that happen at specific times. But you might also be interested in like cutting horizontally across those things and not having to talk about the whole process itself, just like a interesting part. And often this is associated with like frequencies or changes that are repetitive, or like rates, like, so my heart beating over time. It's not like a vertical slicing thing. What I'm interested in is this sub-process of John's life, this that we often will measure, like, and we'll take measurements of, like my heart rate. My watch is doing it right now, and they'll generate like documents and like charts and whatnot. But it's just like this sliver cut horizontally across all the processes that I'm engaged in. And that's what's happening here. They're like characterizing speed of this ship in its active motion. They're just curious about this one aspect of the motion. And it's a horizontal cut across the process. Does that make sense? Okay.
And it's important to have these be simplified, like elegant like this, because if you look at like a fleet, well, you might have to do this at 28 ships, right? So this is very repeatable. And then if you want to make it more, then you could probably use this to do other things as well. Like you can use this as your template to build other simple things for the fleet of ships, or for the sortie or something.
That is absolutely right. I want to say real quick. So I was giving this a hard time because I was talking about I was like, I would have done the information set, and they didn't. And I was giving it a hard time. I want to do that. I'm doing that because if you're reading the competency question and you're looking at the possible ambiguities, and you're anything like me, you were probably worth thinking, what's information? I should be modeling information. Now, there's a reason they went the other way. And it's because these texts, these strings that are hanging, these annotations that are hanging off the classes, like that's another way to capture the information. So it's not like they've collapsed or obscured or overlooked the ambiguities. It's just that they've modeled them differently. So they've said, look, there is a temporal region. That's one aspect of the ambiguity around hours. But it's not like we're overlooking the fact that there's a measurement involved. And they're just representing that measurement as this annotation hanging off, right? And
this is from
instead of putting that in ice as an information content entity that's hanging out on its own, and then there's relationships across there. Instead of doing that, they've got an annotation property. Now, when you're adjudicating whether to do that or not, the question you're thinking through is how much of the information do I need to represent explicitly in the ontology? Because you can get by with like strings and annotation properties. The way to answer this is to think through, what's the extent to which I need to reason over instances of information? I say that because these annotation properties are ignored by reasoners. You don't see them. Their reasoners don't engage with them. They're obscure. They don't even exist. But if you need to run like some reasoning over the information explicitly, then you're actually going to have to represent it as something like an information content entity and not an annotation property. And that is, I mean, this is not going to get you to reasoning over the information specifically. But that's not to say there aren't opportunities to do that. So you have to make a judgment call on what you're trying to do with a competency question. And I will say that they're compatible, right? You can recover from this design pattern, one in which you have the information content entity explicit, and you can go the other way too. So, but it is important to keep in mind.
It's also important to know, like, what is your mission? So, like, for example, Tim and I, we build a Foundry. So we basically just build reference level ontologies. We're not dealing with user level information. You take like Alan Rutenberg, for example, he works on classified and he does the same type of thing. So the thing is that you need to leave a level of ambiguity for the data engineer who's actually going to use this. And so what a model like this allows you to do, it allows you to build something in an unclassified environment, in a dev environment, and then use it in a high side environment. And I'm trying to relate this back to this class because this is what we're doing. So the thing is out of this whole model here, what I always tell people is like classes are never usually, it's very rare for a class to be like classified. The thing that's classified isn't the patrol ship or the fact that it has active motion or the fact that it takes a lot of time to get to a place. It's the fact that how long does it take at a top speed to get to location X? So that 1.5 hours or something down there is like, we're just putting that in as a placeholder. That's not real. But so when you now have the patrol ship and you have a hull number on it, now it becomes real. And now you start getting into what we call C4I. So it's like when you can have one piece of information and that's not classified. But when you start adding like location, speed, sources and methods, like something that is internally like only known to that program, now you start getting into the classified stuff. And that's what they'll have in the object property assertion at the instance level. That is the kind of stuff that's going to be classified. So you can build the model completely unclassified with these nominal kind of pointers down to this very vague, hey, this is where you would put this classified information. And then you can still work in an unclassified environment and help classified people.
That's absolutely right. This is a very good point. And another, like, if you're not compelled by the classified, unclassified motive, there's another avenue or reason to get to the same point. And so, like, we're not trying to build either design patterns or ontologies that are so precise as to be fragile. Because, and we're certainly not trying to hand those off to developers. If we build so precisely that we've like perfectly characterized a specific use case or specific competency question, we run the risk of only being able to answer that. We saw some of this, like you've gotten some exposure. Remember when we were looking at the propulsion, like the submarine, and I think Mike had pointed out, he's like, you know, this is not nuclear, like this excludes nuclear, like we're not measuring nuclear. That's sort of a question you should keep in mind. Like, am I, by imposing like this design pattern having specific parts that exclude nuclear or measurements of nuclear sub movement underwater? Like, is that what I'm trying to do? Because now I can't use this design pattern, at least off the cuff, for those nuclear measurements. And now you might, as an ontologist, know, and you probably do, oh, I could just adjust this. This is fine. Like, I can fix that. I can make it more, you know, less precise and cover the same phenomena. But you're not the only one using these design patterns. You will often be handing these design patterns off to people who are not ontologists, and you need to give them enough guidance, but not too much guidance. You don't want them to hang themselves. You just want them to get a nice rope burn.
John, there's a good example that we had to do. So we were building a design pattern around ships and about the idea that every ship has a port or like a home port. And then somebody asked us, well, you're focusing on just naval ships. What about like fishing vessels or like civilian ships? So then we brought all these civilian ships in, and in our original design pattern, I made it so that we had this concept of strategic home porting, which is basically a policy that the United States Navy made in the early 1980s in order to strategically home port ships so that, like, if we ever had to go to war, we could like go to war quickly. This is all unclassified, don't worry. But this has been known for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. But the problem is that I linked strategic home porting to all watercraft. Well, I can't do that. So then I had an agent, which is a watercraft agent, right? And I linked it to participates in strategic home porting. And then I realized later when I was looking at it, oh, I can't do that because it's a universal. So I had to go back and change my model so that I had a watercraft agent and I had like a naval agent, right? And the naval agent is the only one that deals with strategic home porting as a participation of process. And then the everybody, everybody who's a shipboat captain on any type of dinghy deals with home porting, right? So sometimes you have to look at like how this is where things can get brittle, right, John? Like if you're not careful here.
That's right. And these are the consequences of brittleness. Well, I mean, they can be like if you're trying to do this work with integrity and like with an eye towards the future, you're going to engage, and you find yourself in a situation, you're going to engage in the modeling the way Jay just did. He's like, I realized I had to change something. Oftentimes, people realize it and be like, whatever. And then we get like that's problems downstream. So like what Jay has illustrated is both how these sort of situations can come up even for experienced modelers. And then I think the sort of reflective revision that needs to be conducted once you realize a mistake has been made, or at least maybe these things are too brittle. And like, so this is I appreciate you sharing that. This is a good example, something you should keep in mind. I mean, like, as a rule of thumb, like learn from Jay's experience. Let me give you something else to work with too. Some common ambiguities that you will see again and again and again. So you should just have these arrows in your quiver to keep in mind. And you've seen me talk about these over and over again. They come up even among people who know better or like who are experienced. They still come up, and it's understandable. They're hard often when you're dealing with complicated phenomena to keep straight. Some more than others. So at the top, you see classes versus instances. People confuse this all the time. The best intentioned people do it all the time. My favorite example, I won't name the person who did it, but the first time I saw this person's ontology, and I met with them to talk about it, I was like, Armenia is not a class. There are no instances of Armenia. And they were like, oh, snap. You're right. It's an instance, right? But you can see how somebody might fall into the trap. Like, I think once I pointed it out, this person and her advisor, they were both like, oh, yeah. But, I get it. I get it if you're not thinking very carefully. In a more maybe subtle way this might come up, I'll point here to the occupation ontology work. So some of the folks working on this ontology, they generated classes for things like USSOC code pharmacist. And they would make that, first they made them material entities, which is just wrong because this is like occupation code. And so if anything, it should be a GDC, a generically dependent continuous information, right? Also, it's not a class. It's like a specific code in the USSOC for pharmacists. It has a number and everything, like a specific instance of like an occupation code. But it's you can see why they generated it. But you should ask yourself whenever you're like thinking through classes, you should have, or instances, you should have this in your mind when you're adding things in an ontology. Can I make instances of this thing? If you can't, then it is an instance. That's it. Like John Beverly, there are no instances except for me. I am not a class. Human is a class, and I am an instance of human, right? Like that's the back and forth that you should have. And if you see something that like throws you out, you're like, is that an instance or a class? That's the litmus test. And you've seen me say this again and again. I said it earlier on this design pattern. Like, what are the instances of that? It's none, because that's an instance. All right, information versus what information is about. Again, you see this all the time. We've covered it many times. I won't actually belabor it, but because you've had plenty of examples, and you'll see again and again examples in your experience. People confuse this all the time. The confusion is often easy to disambiguate. It's easy to point out. And you can do it just the way I've said again and again. Hopefully I'm massaging that into your brain. It's like a locution you should use when you're talking to people about this. Information is different from what information is about. Like what usually, in my experience, saying just that, people, they do that little calculus symbols come up in their head and they're like, oh, I get it. Because it's like a very subtle, it's almost obvious, but it's still a little subtle for people. But if you just make that distinction, English will help you, and they're like, wait a second, there's some ambiguity here that I wasn't tracking exactly. Realizable entities versus processes. So remember, realizable entities are like they're dependent entities of material things. And they are what underwrite what those things do. Salt is soluble, but it doesn't necessarily dissolve. That is a distinction. It is still a quality of salt, of sodium chloride, that it could dissolve in the right context. But those are separate things. Right? The dissolving is different from being soluble. So that is often confused too. People will regularly describe, like it's not uncommon, even for that example, despite the fact that I say it all the time, people will look at sodium chloride, they're like, I need to characterize solubility. And they're like, they'll create a process and be like, this thing's dissolving. But think about what that means. You're saying this specific instance of salt is dissolving, always. And that's how you characterize solubility. No, that's absolutely not how you do it, because it may or may not dissolve. And you want to be able to capture that, what we call in philosophy circles, the modal aspect of material things, what they can do, not what they have to do or have done. It's the modality. That's how we capture modality, like possibilities in BFO. We do it with like actual concrete dependent, like specifically dependent continuous born by bearers, like material things. And then we separate that from the actual manifestations of them. And that's how we distinguish between what something can do and what something has done.
Just in big way for myself, are all realizable entities dispositions?
No.
No.
There are also roles
Oh,
and
okay.
functions. So functions are dispositions that have this normative aspect to them. Like they're like, it should do this.
Should.
It could be malfunctioning, for instance. Like it is a disposition of my heart to pump blood. It's also a function of my heart to pump blood. It's the reason my heart exists, and it could do it poorly or better. It could malfunction, it could afunction, or it could just function properly. Fingers crossed. And then roles are those realizable entities that are more contextually based. So like we're actually going to talk about one in a minute. I have a fun example to play with. But like being a student is a role. And what comes with roles, much like other realizables, are new powers you can think of that don't necessarily have to manifest, even in the context or when you're in the appropriate context. Like I'm a professor now, I'm on campus, I'm in class, I don't have to profess. I don't have to grade you. I don't have to do all these things. I have the authority to, I just don't always exercise it. I don't have to always exercise it. It's still quality of me that I can. Or specifically dependent continuum is separate from the actual realization of that.
And I suppose that is different. So because I know realizable entity would be the class.
The parent, yeah.
Role would be a subclass.
That's right.
Is there for like solubility, the ones where we want to say no, like the hard dispositionalists will say, in this context, it absolutely will happen. There is no way that it couldn't, et cetera, et cetera. Is there something beyond like a subclass for that? Or is that just realizable?
We don't draw a distinction between like necessity, like modal necessity and modal possibility.
Okay.
There's not been a need to really.
I see.
So, but this is not opposed, like you could. We just don't have a reason to. I mean, in some circles, people want to talk about like laws of nature, and they'll have this kind of, if you've got like an Armstrongian bent, you've got like something built in. We can model that sort of stuff. It's just there hasn't been data around that. And would there be like, I don't know, maybe. There's some people in Brazil thinking about this. I can point you if they're interested. They're trying to model a necessary modality using dispositions. Yeah. Okay, so spatial regions versus site versus boundaries. Fun stuff. Fun. This ambiguity this is coming up a lot recently, and it's really pissing me off. But anyway, to me, so these are thorny ambiguities, but I think it's largely, if I may say so, because there are thorny philosophical and physics questions that get in the way. I think I can sort through them rather easily, though. I have a background in metaphysics. I also, if you don't know, have a background in engineering, and we took a lot of physics, and I spent a lot of time thinking about physics. And so I think I can help sort through some of this pretty cleanly. So like in our understanding in BFO, spatial regions are whatever coordinate systems, whatever measurements about space, et cetera, are about. What that is, we don't say. Much like with realism, where we say there is a real world out there, that's it. We don't, you carve it up however you want. Same with spatial regions. It's the same move. We don't take a stand, and there's a reason we don't take a stand. It is not obvious what physics or metaphysics says about what space-time is. So quantum mechanics has one story, general relativity has another. They're not obviously compatible. People are still working out. We're not here to adjudicate, we're here to describe. And so at the level at which we engage with what a spatial region is as far down as we need to go, and then let the scientists do their work. That's the physics side. On the metaphysics side, there's this dispute, as I'm sure some of you are aware, between substantivalism and relativism, like relational views of space. Substantivalism is the position that they're like absolute thing. There's absolute space out there. It's substantive. It's a thing, like dots on a map, etc. But don't confuse the coordinates with the thing. And then the relational view is like, that's not true. All that exists, all that is, or space is just like put things in positions related to other things. And so both of these can be carved up conceptually in different ways. We do this with coordinate systems all the time, but the substantive metaphysical question underwriting it is what exactly we're carving up. Is this like backdrop of space, or is it just things positioned in space? And we're suggesting with our models that there is some background or something like that. We don't have an answer to that. We're not trying to answer that question. All we're saying is spatial region, there's something out there. Measure it however you want, carve it up however you want. It's just there. Whether it's relational, whether it's substantival. Yeah, Jay?
Would a great example of this be when Barry went down to all those physicists in Alabama last year and had that lecture? It's on YouTube. And they got into fluid dynamics. And like, he had to basically say, you're right. I mean, they basically eviscerated PFO from a quantum perspective. And I know that Barry has been saying, hey, there needs to be a physics and a quantum outside of BFO, but like, this is a good example of that, right? Like, if you go back and watch that lecture, you'll see it's really a phenomenal Q&A session after the lecture.
Yeah, I think Barry has traditionally in this space suggested or maybe even believed that BFO is committed to more than it has to be committed to. So what I just did in this description avoids all of that. Like there is, and I have talked to the Q&M folks, and I've talked to the relative. I mean, we talk, I know enough to know where to avoid those thorny questions, and we don't have to answer them. And it's the same maneuver I take when I'm arguing with biologists or virologists about viruses. And invariably they ask me whether viruses are alive. And I'm like, I don't need to answer that question. Tell me in the data where it says I need to tell you that viruses are alive or not. And they're like, fair point. I'm like, let's move on. Same here. Tell me in the data where I need to come down on that. I don't. And so, yeah, I think this is an example, and this is not at all to knock Barry. Barry's trying to do good work. And I don't think the physics is there yet for us to do that work. And so for me, I'm waiting. Same with viruses. I'm waiting. I'm describing, not prescribing. And so I don't want to weigh in on this area. I know enough to avoid the problems, but I don't know enough to actually answer the questions, right? So I'm waiting on the Q&M and the GM or GR people to solve this for me, and then I'll describe it. Does that make sense?
And we can solve a million problems without having to go into quantum.
Absolutely.
Like the people in the industrial ontology foundry, unless they have to deal with quantum computing because that's what they're going to be doing, they don't really care.
They don't, and they shouldn't. I mean, I'll do that. Have a grant for it. Okay, so let me distinguish those sites. These are distinguished from sites. So here's a litmus test for you when you're thinking about sites. Sites are immaterial entities. They move. Their sites are movable often. It's like the site above an airport and the movement of this thing as the earth turns and all that good celestial blah, blah, blah. Now, you can also think of this in relationship to spatial regions. Sites have to move through something. What are they moving through? It's not another site. Okay, so there's a relationship there. Just keep this. This is not always the case, especially if you get down into the details, but it's not a bad rule of thumb. Sites are moving through stuff. Sites don't have to move, by the way. This is one of the reasons I say it's not a 100%, but it is not a bad rule of thumb to think about sites as often moving or movable and moving through something, like the trunk of your car, not the material stuff or the perforation of the material stuff, but the site is moving sometimes. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's in the parking lot. The basin or the site where the basin of the ocean is separate from the water, separate from the molecules. It's a site. It's pretty stationary, although depending on your reference frame, it might be moving. The site that was where a river was located in ancient times, and archaeologists are trying to find that site. The river's not there. None of the atoms are there. What are they looking for? A site, right? Separate that from boundaries. Boundaries are, I think of, so where sites are three-dimensional things, like three-dimensional immaterial objects, I think of site or boundaries that go two-dimensional, one-dimensional, zero-dimensional as related to sites in the following way. Where two sites connect or intersect, that is a two-dimensional boundary. Where two-dimensional boundaries intersect, that is a one-dimensional boundary. Like two planes intersect at a line. Similarly, where two one-dimensional boundaries, that is two lines intersect, that is a point, zero-dimensional boundary. So this is the relationship. And now boundaries are dependent on sites in this sense. Boundaries are dependent on something. They're boundaries of something. I have a boundary. It's like the boundary of me and space around me, right? Or the boundary of me and the air around me or something like that. There were things, three-dimensional things connect or two-dimensional things, etc. Right? Again, separate from spatial regions. Yeah, I think.
So one nuance here that I don't want to get confused with site.
Mm-hmm.
The temporality of site doesn't matter. It's only the materiality of it. Because if I have an old riverbed,
Mm-hmm.
what I want to say is that the dried up riverbed, the site of it is where the material was.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to say that site is not here now when
Mhm.
archaeologists start digging because the
Do you
material.
really want to say this? You're interested in the material? Are you really interested in the water? Which water?
No, I meant
Which ground? Which rock?
No. I meant that part.
Uh-huh.
That ground, that rock. This is why I'm trying to be clear, though.
Mhm.
It seems like what I'm saying is the site is actually delineated temporarily, whereas I'm pretty sure I could probably come up with something where the site I'm trying to delineate is what we're working on a vending machine thing. The site would be like where the products go, right?
Yeah.
But that's not temporarily bound, really.
I mean-
That's not the line I'm trying to separate it on.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, is this possible? Because if it's dependent on a material entity, I know material entities are obviously in time, but
So there's some material entity that'll, like if you're looking for where a river once was,
right.
you're indexing to some material thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not gonna be the material thing that once was, or the
Right.
material area that once was, not the water, not the rocks. You're interested in like some kind of geospatial location, roughly speaking, that corresponds to where stuff like that used to be. And you see this in archaeologists, they'll like publish papers and like, I found where there was this river that used to flow between Troy and some other place, and like this is blah blah blah. And they're like, you can go there now, and they're like, there's nothing, there's no river there. But what are they trying to say? They're like, well, I'm doing this geospatial reasoning stuff. I'm looking at like the historical record. I'm looking at like what we know the consequences of the previously being a river here, looking at like patterns of weather and whatnot. And they're like doing inferencing and they're figuring out, they're asserting based on that, I can show, or at least there's evidence to think that there was a river here And this is the river that maybe like the Romans were talking about.
And John, isn't it where Chris falls flat?
Maybe. Wait, what? Say more. Chris Partridge?
Yes.
Oh, say more.
Well, because
God, fine.
he models everything in 4 dimensions, and so he uses a Calvinistic approach to the world. So therefore, it's really hard for him to model things like riverbeds and ancient riverbeds
Mhm.
because the I think that the system would be really confused because it no longer has water.
Yeah, I think they actually can't. So I think their model puts a lot of the relations that you need to tease this out just on the 4D side. But
Okay.
they can still tease this stuff out. It's just like a different way of viewing. At the end of the day, it's just a different way of viewing. Are you talking about things that endure through time versus things that are time or temporal or occurrency? And they're just always talking about the occurrent stuff. And so
Would you say that the dispositions of a riverbed are the things that intrinsically change over, say, 100,000 years or something?
Oh, I don't know that. I'm not a riverbed
Well,
specialist.
I mean, if you were looking at like we have an ancient riverbed, it no longer is a river, but it is a riverbed, just like an active river, like the Mississippi, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the dispositions surrounding that riverbed have changed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's a dried up riverbed, or it's a lake that was a lake, but it's in the Sahara now,
Yeah,
or
this is
it's
right.
ancient riverbeds that leave Los Angeles County and
Mhm.
are 300, 400 miles out into the Pacific Ocean.
That's right. They're
But
like dispositions underwriting aggregate, or like they're aggregates of dispositions underwritten by specific things with dispositions. And some of those like uh the dispositions that emerge from the aggregates might disappear if you lose some of the pieces. And like this is like the ebb and flow of environmental changes. And so
yeah,
some things like they're like environments or ecosystems that can support certain flora and fauna and like ecological whatnots. And then when things fall apart, they fall apart. And then species die, rivers dry up, etc. And so I think
and
there's positions
this,
throughout.
yeah. And couldn't this be a great example of why when we say that ontologies change because of the science and everything, like these could change because like there could be a report that comes out in 5 years that explains why a riverbed basically becomes inhabitable or something, and we didn't know that. So then it changes the way that we looked at certain dispositions or something. And then you
Absolutely.
can look at a model and you could say like, okay, well, if these 9 things happen, then all of a sudden, lake whatever will dry up and won't be a lake anymore. But like it needs 15 things in order to be a viable lake or a viable river. And
That's
this
right.
changes
Would be Pluto.
why we have to constantly update.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this, usually getting into something like the predictors. If we get really specific about the dispositions that are required in certain ecosystems, then we can start predicting and planning for what we need to preserve if we want to maintain this. That's one side. And the other side is just like genuine scientific decisions that that change how we look at the world. Like Pluto used to be a planet. It's not anymore. And why? They had good reasons, like control over its orbit. It does not have it. Other planets do. There's like a legit shift in consensus around this, and the scientific community voted to not have it as part of the planets anymore for these reasons. And so now, we had to change things. Let me talk about varieties of dependence before I give you a juicy nugget to chew on. So varieties of dependence. This is kind of open-ended. You've seen some dependence relationships. I've talked about them here and there. But when I say dependence, I mean basically object properties. Like there's a lot of ambiguity built in object properties. Parthood is in some sense a dependency relation. My hand is dependent in some sense on my arm and on me. Now, dependence itself is vague and ambiguous. We specify the dependence by saying this is a part, my hand is a part of my arm, right? Processes in some sense depend on participants. Like baking a cake involves ingredients and me, and eating it also involves me over and over again. There's like dependence, and then dependence of like qualities on bears, like the redness of a flower. It depends on something, it depends on the flower, right? Like when you're looking at the world and you're like going through the list of qualities and realizables and processes, you'll ultimately be spelling out connections across elements of that list in terms of dependence. And most of the time, things depend on the material stuff. If you're looking at BFO, almost all of the classes in the structure, if you're thinking of dependence, point towards material things. Ultimately, either transitively or directly. Information's about something, and that information can be about all sorts of things. But if most of the rest of the ontology points back to material things, well, we have something that everything ultimately points to. It's not the case that everything ultimately points there, but like most of the stuff in the hierarchy ultimately is dependent on material things. More broadly, ultimately dependent on independent continuants, which themselves don't depend on anything. You see, dependence is built in. Now, the way this really works, I'll say this and then we'll move on, but like, if you exclude spatial regions, spatiotemporal regions, and temporal regions, everything in BFO ultimately depends on independent continuants. Everything else. Now, if you then think about independent continuants in relationships to spatiotemporal regions, spatial regions, and temporal regions, independent continuants depend on spatiotemporal regions. And spatiotemporal regions depend on spatial regions and temporal regions. And that's how ultimately all the dependence works. Okay. Everything but space-time depends on independent continuants. Independent continuants depend on space-time. That's it. And there are, of course, nuances about what do you mean by dependence. But you'll note I just used dependence in many, many ways as I was fleshing that out. And we specify as much of that as we can to sort out ambiguities of like qualities depending on independent continuants and like independent continuants depending in some way on spatiotemporal regions or processes that themselves project on spatiotemporal regions that themselves project on spatial regions and temporal regions. Okay, I know that was a lot. I just want to highlight dependence. A lot of this is dependence, and you just need to keep in mind where the arrows are pointing. And that will help you as a heuristic, like sort out ambiguities. Next time we talk about this, I'll have some slides to illustrate exactly these kind of arrows, and I'll show them to you there. But before we run out of time, I do want you to model this. I would like for you to model Barack Obama being the US president for 8 years. That's this guy. I don't know if you know who he is. It's pretty suave. And use your list. Here's your guide.
Yeah.
All right. So
Can you make it bigger, Jay?
everybody see this? So what I need to do right now is I need to just
Go
verify.
full screen.
Huh?
Go full screen.
Because instances.
I'm going to bring up the
With
wonderful
Barack Obama, like presidents in general.
this of this. So here we go. I think human being is a class.
So I would do something power to make certain decisions. That a lot of things can fall under that. Yeah,
Person.
exactly. Yeah.
Person.
Strictly speaking, you can only have.
Person is off of animal, which is off of organism, which is off of object. We're gonna make Barack a person.
Yep.
Good thing, right?
Seems reasonable.
That sounds right.
All right.
Try to keep this as simple as possible. So make sure.
Again, I could be wrong.
We could be, but.
All right, and then we create a specific instance off a person, that's him. And then we're gonna have qualities.
In console is more general.
So
I mean, it's different.
quality of being Barack Obama, I don't think that's a quality, that's
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
I think qualities for him can be that he's what? He's enigmatic, he's smart, he's a good orator. Well, I don't know if that's a quality though. So let's go look and see here. So this is where if CCO is better, right? You would already have these universal qualities that a person would have, like.
Wouldn't you apply the role, like role of president?
Yeah, so I mean,
Right, wouldn't that, I mean, if you're not boiling the ocean, right? Let's focus on the low hanging fruit.
well, yeah, but I mean, I'm just saying what he put in here, right? So we have roll, let's just go to
Nor was.
adult role.
Residency role.
A role inhering in a person in virtue of that person being the subject of socio-legal designation that's an adult. So I mean, he is an adult, but we don't care about that. Artifact role, authority role.
Yeah, I mean, he's a president.
Definitely.
Yeah, I
Right?
know.
mean, do we have to go further down than that?
I mean, they have United States Command, National Command Authority role. I think we can go to authority role.
I know.
We have civilian role.
I say, hey,
Isn't there a political?
Role that inheres an agent or group who is not a member of the armed services.
and immediately I'm like,
I mean, he's kind of both.
any various ways.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I'm looking at all the roles here,
I'm not gonna be in town for the.
geopolitical power role.
I would just put him under occupation role, right? Because that's his occupation was as president.
You have always appropriate to use for overtime.
Active employment.
And that's where I
Because otherwise he's
Geopolitical
former
power
president.
role only applies to organizations.
Yeah. So we can give him an occupational role as president. That's fine. So we're
Can
gonna
we
get
do it past tense because he's
we're gonna
not
get rid of
currently
qualities right now. Well, no, then you would have it be temporally
temporalized.
bounded. You would
Okay.
have it temporally bounded. So
Yeah, I can't have that.
Which- Those
Hold on.
determine what a temporal region.
Let's call it.
so role falls under, I believe role falls under quality.
So I know I didn't give you enough
That's a
time
realizable
to review
entity.
much. So I will allow you. I will
We should
permit,
have role here. We're just gonna say
Fran,
role
I will
instead of
permit you to
quality.
work on this outside.
Role.
So if you don't mind, think about this a little more. It's actually a surprisingly tricky example. Do what you can. And please, feel free to work a little bit on this outside of class if you are so inclined. You don't have to, but I will allow it. One of those rare opportunities because we didn't spend too much time on it in class today. But I am curious what you have to say about it, given what you know. So, and with that, you don't have to go, but you don't have to stay.
Okay.